guys and gals, and welcome back to another episode of Haunted Gaming. This time we take a look at a creepypasta revived from the archives of 4chan, the internet's most lovable place, and take a look at a creepypasta called Winds of Regret, and also Stigmata and Mizu. So why don't you take a seat, relax, and enjoy Winds of Regret. Kenji Eno is one of the more interesting men to hit the video game industry. As enthusiasts know, his horror title D made a splash in America for getting by on a teen rating despite dealing rather nonchalantly with cannibalism. The sequel, D2, would have an infamously nigh tentacle rape cinematic. He locked himself in a hotel room with composer Michael Nyman until 6 hours later he agreed to compose the soundtrack for his sci-fi survival horror title, Enemy Zero, which fails spectacularly for being incredibly unforgiving. The titular enemy is completely invisible and can only be detected through sound. Needless to say, Eno himself is a man worth researching, although these days his occasional endeavors are hardly of interest. But the simple and rather pedestrian story is centered on a different game called Kaze no Regret, which translates to Winds of Regret, a game that fulfilled Eno's burgeoning interest in the limiting of the senses in video games. I already mentioned Enemy Zero, but D2 also had sections where the player must navigate the game world based solely on sight or sound. See, Eno wanted to create a game that could be equally enjoyed by seeing players and blind players. This somewhat ridiculous concept led to the Japan-only release of Winds of Regret in 1997 for the Sega Saturn, along with Eno giving away 1,000 Saturn units to blind players in Tokyo. For those of you familiar with visual novels, Winds of Regret plays exactly like one, but without the visual part, of course. It's narrated by various voice talents in its entirety and tells a story of young love and loss, which becomes quickly entwined with a suspenseful tale. Eno was known for injecting horror into everything he dealt with, after all. For those not familiar with the genre, Winds of Regret is like a choose-your-own-adventure game, where events are narrated and then you reach a point where you must make a decision. Once you do, the narrative continues until you reach the next narrative forked road. This build results in expansive dialogue trees and ultimately multiple endings. I am quite obviously not blind, but I was always interested in Eno's work and the concept of Winds of Regret, and the fact that it was greenlighted and actually released hooked me. I think I first found it in a blog by a young temp working in Japan, but I can't remember anymore. After copious personal research and lots of e-haggling, I finally got my hands on a copy of Winds of Regret. Even the packaging is unique and done with evident attention for detail. The box itself is transparent, marked by a soothing blue sky motif, and the instruction booklet is in Braille. I also heard that early copies came with a bag of herbal seeds, but mine didn't come with such a thing. It all starts as expected. There is, of course, nothing to see on screen, just Japanese speech narrated slowly and clearly introducing the game. Then it tells you which button to press to start the game. So I do. As I actually play through it, the game feels like a somewhat sad experience, not only because a complete lack of visuals is disheartening, but because of the concept itself. Winds of Regret begins story-wise in middle school. You're initially put into the role of Mizu Sakura, a shy girl who is transferred to a new school and is soon completely smitten with classmate Hiroshi Nonoiti. The exceedingly young couple decides to elope, which is a pretty common narrative element in Japanese love stories, and are to meet at the school clock tower at a certain hour of night to escape. Mizu never shows up, probably because she suddenly acquired a modicum of common sense, and it's this point that the story moves away from character-based perspectives and places you as an omnipresent god audience, watching the lives of the various characters unfold in the city below as years pass by. Mizu and Hiroshi meet once after their failed escape, and then go on with their lives separately, until a mysterious death in the Tokyo subway system makes them run into each other again. The only thing that surprised me about the first 20 or so minutes of Winds of Regret was a single visual that leaped onto the screen at one point, in between loading for two scenes. A sprite-based rendering of the clock tower where Mizu and Hiroshi were to meet appears. The clock clearly signals 8 o'clock, which is the correct time for the young couple to meet. Later research confirmed that the version with limited visuals of Winds of Regret was released, but for the Dreamcast. I was playing the original version on the Saturn, so it was impossible for me to have a mixed-up version. I continued anyways. As I mentioned earlier, the plot of Winds of Regret quickly takes a turn for the suspenseful, but not the full-on horrific. The sequel was planned to be a full-fledged horror title, but never saw the light of day due to a voice compression issue, I think. Remember, the entire game is voice narrated. Spoiling the plot would be rather harmless, but there's no need to do it anyways. Just rest assured that there is something in the subway system killing people, and it is surprisingly related to Mizu and Hiroshi's childhood promise. Now this is where things get a little weird. Quite simply, after a certain crucible in the plot, Images accompanying the narration begin to appear. As I mentioned before, this cannot possibly be the image-enhanced Dreamcast version, so there's no real explanation for them. Other than maybe this is a beta version of the aforementioned DC port with placeholder images. Then again, I did get it in its full packaging. The images themselves are remarkably mundane. They're all low quality, and based on what the people are wearing, that's probably taken sometimes during the 1980s, most of them are pictures of Japanese everyday life in major urban centers. A friend of mine identified a particular picture as having been taken in the Golden Gai district of Tokyo. They have pretty much nothing to do with what the game is actually describing. When the narration gets to the point where Hiroshi explores an abandoned subway tunnel, the game is showing you an image of a young Japanese woman staring straight at the camera and smiling, as if posing for a rather tacky advert. Moving towards the final stretch of the game, the pictures become more intimate. They depict the inside of a tiny apartment bathroom or the apartment itself, or the view from the balcony. Although, so far, none of my Japanese net acquaintances have managed to identify where this picture could have been taken from, while in previous images the photographers seem to have simply taken pictures of what surrounded him. A homeless man in the park, children playing on a swing set, so and so. He or she now has moved on to create apparently deliberate set pieces, such as a zoomed-in picture of 2 English toy blocks, each depicting an English alphabet letter on the side, spelling out no. One could argue that at this point the pictures also gain some degree of coherence with the narrative, although it's faint. A rather odd element of Western religious imagery creeps into the game, such as a group of picture of young Kogal. They're essentially Japanese valley girls wearing crucifix necklaces, a popular fashion statement in Tokyo as I am told. This is congruent with the theme of salvation present in later comparisons of Mizu and Hiroshi to Adam and Eve. There are other faint links which friends have pointed out to me, but there's nothing particularly worth mentioning except for maybe the series of pictures depicted during the ending scenes. Consistency in quality and the generally improvised nature of the shots suggest that the same person using the camera was responsible for them. They're notable in that they no longer take place in the open public spaces or the inside of, presumably, the photographer's apartment. Instead, they begin with a picture taken of an open sewer manhole leading straight down into darkness. If you're wondering where the game's narration is at this point, it's in the final dialogue, which I won't spoil, but it's completely unrelated to anything depicted in the pictures. What is really interesting is that, as I mentioned, dialogue trees in this game have various branches. Paths that the conversation can go, depending on the player's answers. Each path seems to be mapping out a procession of images taken down here in the sewer complex. So whenever you play through this final sequence of dialogue, you're also exploring a different section of the sewers as you progress through the series of photographs. During my first playthrough, I elected what I thought was the standard path of dialogue to go down. You know how in games you're sometimes given a choice, but there's an obvious right answer, and the game wants you to pick, and then the others are just going to lead to a dead end eventually. I picked the right answers. That's not to say there aren't any endings, though. So the conversation progressed, and the photographer's little bout of urban exploration progressed in the pictures as well. I was reminded that Winds of Regret was designed for blind players. And imagine a blind person happily playing through this game, not knowing what's going on the screen at all. In the very end, the photographer goes down a particular sewer path, with the gunk up to his or her knees, I would presume. The camera inches closer to a bulge lying on the side of a canal, until the very last picture reveals what it is. A dead cat. Superimposed in the picture is what looks like a tacky word art rendering of "congratulations" with a bizarre additional exclamation point, but it's pretty blurry. Then the game just ends, nothing else of note happens. Why would Eno include this on purpose in copies of Winds of Regret? There's no real reason. I haven't come across a single internet testimony or reference to demonstrate that this strange picture path appeared in any other version of the game. The visuals friendly port for the Dreamcast does include images, as I mentioned, but they are stills drawn in the anime style and congruent with the game's story, not the odd low-quality pictures in my copy of the game. I picked some other options to see if there was anything else amiss, in order to cement the possibility of this being an early beta version with some additional content that was later removed, but everything else seems to work fine, so under the assumption that it was some kind of joke by the development staff, I decided to play along and started a second playthrough. Now, have you ever played Suda51's Killer 7 for the PlayStation 2 and GameCube? Once you finish it, and if you choose to begin the second playthrough, it will turn into Killer 8, if memory serves, and the opening logo instantly changes. There's a new mode where you can play as an additional character. Something similar happens with the Winds of Regret. The logo in kanji changes to Kaze no Stigmata, Winds of Stigmata, and Stigmata is spelled out in English alphabet characters, thinking that this may be a bonus mode. I began the game. Everything is the same, though, including the pictures, although some of them may have been swapped in terms of order here and there, or that may just be a repercussion of the different choices I made in this playthrough in comparison to the last one. I was just playing to get to the ending dialogue and see what I would find this time. I picked a different set of answers during the final dialogue, this time going for the Maverick path, the path that the game is tactically pushing you into not taking. There is, of course, an alternate end where events play out differently, but at this point I'd lost interest in the plot of Winds of Regret and was instead looking intently at the pictures. Once again, the photographer leads us through the sewer system, but this time he or she goes down a different path, which seems to lead further down. The very last picture depicts the ceiling of the sewer canal. It's worth noting this is the only picture taken with visible flash. It depicts graffiti painted on the ceiling, of a pair of eyes and a pair of hands, and once again, that's all. My leading theory regarding this picture path in the final sequence of the game is that the development studio decided to include a little extra for one lucky Winds of Regret player, thus creating an alternate story that had nothing to do with the narrative, but told through pictures. It's interesting, even if it defeated Eno's purpose of creating a game that a blind player could enjoy equally to those with sight, because it instead created a game that people could enjoy on entirely different levels that were parallel from each other. But game design theories aside, it seems to be a studio spoof. Now, I haven't done a lot of research around this yet, but as far as I know, Winds of Regret has 3 different endings plus one joke ending that can be attained about halfway through the game. The other 3 are the results of different choices you make during the final dialogue sequences. The one with the sewer picture, knowing this, I started a 3rd playthrough of the game to finish the final path. The logo changed once again to Kaze no Mizu, Winds of Mizu, translated, apparently named after the titular heroine. As with the 2nd playthrough, everything else about the game was unchanged other than the pictures. However, the final sewer path and its results were probably the most surprising. I picked the 3rd set of dialogue options, which, morally speaking, is sort of a neutral path in between the good and the evil paths. Visual novels don't really have a whole lot of moral ambiguity most of the time. Once again, I was treated to a picture tour of what I assume is Tokyo's expansive sewer system. This time, I was shocked about halfway through the dialogue. The photographer was heading back. The picture showed him or her retracing steps back to the ladder leading to the surface world. The final set of pictures shows the photographer climbing up the ladder to the light, and in the very final image, the photographer turns the camera on him or herself and takes a picture of his or her own face looking into the lens. The reason why I've continued to refer to the photographer as gender ambiguous is because, well, we don't actually see the face. The photographer's face is blurred out by pixelation due to the point where you can't tell anything about them other than they are presumably a human being. In the background is a nondescript small park, presumably in the middle of a urban center, with some people walking around. I guess it's odd that in the middle of the day nobody stopped him or her from illegally sneaking into the sewers. Just like how tacky congratulations sign is superimposed on the picture of the dead cat in the end of the first path, this one also had some text, which appears a few seconds after the image just sits there. First, an arrow with cutesy pink and white kanji appears, pointing at the person, saying, "This is Mizu." Seconds later, white kanji of great size, taking up the whole screen, shows up. It says Mizu is dead. There are many ways to potentially interpret this, but I feel like at this point I have to spoil the game's story a bit. Mizu, the character, does die if you take this path, so there is a congruence between the picture and the narrative, but I have no idea what the people behind this whole thing were trying to say through the sequence. Maybe one of the developer's relatives was named Mizu and died during development of the game, so he created this weird and complex sequence to honor her. Or maybe it's just a collective spoof by the development team. Did they send a worker they didn't like down to the sewers to take pictures, saying it was for reference, and insert this into a copy of the game without his knowledge? Stranger things have been found in the game code, in places where developers never thought tech-savvy losers would look, but this transcends that. Because I still can't make sense of it, and because it's so goddamn elaborate. There are a couple of other things worth mentioning in regards to my copy of Winds of Regret. Out of a fleeting curiosity, I actually looked up Braille to try and decipher the instruction booklet, and found that the booklet's text actually translates to nothing but gibberish. The Braille makes no sense at all. Chalk it up to misprint, I suppose. Furthermore, I completed my first playthrough of the game. After it, the opening screen's logo once again had changed, but now it changed back after doing this 3rd playthrough to the original Kaze no Regret, but with one difference though. It now has a sort of subtitle in white under the logo, which reads, in barely legible print, "Mizu is dead." I've played through the story a couple more times since then, and the logo has no longer changed. After completing the bizarre 3rd path of the game, Note that I am simply referring to it as the third path because I took it in that order. The paths can be taken in any order depending on the player. I played it again to try to get the joke ending, which can be triggered about halfway through the story and thus shouldn't take long, but to my surprise the joke ending has a page-by-page scan of a chapter of famous boxing manga, Ashita no Joe. While the very last sequence is taken from the old Shintaro Kago one-shot. I suppose whoever was doing this ran out of ideas or time to take pictures of Japanese suburbia. And that's my story regarding my copy of Winds of Regret. I played around with the game a few more times after that, but found nothing else worth noting. I also have to admit I was a little creeped out by the whole picture sequence because I still haven't found anyone else on the net whose copy of the game did anything even remotely similar, so I guess I'll never know the truth. If I ever go back to Tokyo, I guess I'll steer clear from the sewers just in case. Not that I plan on going down there. Anyways. Well, this is, like I said in the beginning, is from an old 4chan thread, so I guess you can say it's a Creepypasta OG. But how was it? Not really great if you ask me. I wouldn't call it a shit pasta, as it did keep me on my toes in the very beginning when we talked about Kenji Ino. And the soundtrack stuff was spot on in the sense that, he actually did convince Michael Nyman for 6 hours in his hotel room. Now, I don't know about being locked in, but it kind of makes sense. I mean, 6 hours on a convincing spree? Shit. So the facts are back, but the biggest problem with this is it's like the Majora's Mask creepypasta with no evidence, though. Seriously, if you ever thought about it, the one thing that made Ben, not just because it was one of the first creepypastas I really remember going into and the first, big ones, but it was also because it was one of the creepypastas that had the footage and evidence tagged along into it, which was so spot on, it melded well with what we were being told. And it made me believe it was real, the whole creepypasta thing, until, I researched that that footage was recreated with cheats and hacks, and, in all honesty, once the gullibility goes aside, it doesn't really seem plausible. Now, that pictures, this creepypasta, that heavily references them and describes them with such immense detail. And I feel that, these are some screenshots have to be necessary. I mean, with the pictures so rare, that they really have to be there. Sure, it's a creepypasta in the game, in the state that it's being described doesn't exist. I get it, but still, something like this, it sort of requires that touch. Maybe it existed in the 4chan archive and was lost in translation when it moved, sites and whatnot. Still, without them, it sort of sucks, as I feel you just need those images. At least that's what I think, because without them we get descriptions, which are intriguing, but because of the fact we get these, invigorating details, we want to see it. I feel that because the game is audio only, the one that it's based on, it's negated from that requirement. But if a picture is rare in that case, we do want to see it. Technically, I like it. It's a solid creepypasta, but it really needed that evidence more so than the rest, and I felt like those screenshots were necessary. I mean, you get that feeling every time you read a creepypasta, but when you read one like this, you really, that just never goes away from you as you're reading it. In the end, I think it's decent, and like always, I ask you, what would you rate it, and what would you change to make it better? This has been another episode of Haunted Gaming. By the way, if you guys are wondering what game is on the screen, it is Fear 2 for the PC. I love this trilogy of games, actually. They're nice, scary, fun games. Really tense, and the shooting's amazing, and it doesn't have that regenerative health stuff. And it's a pretty challenging affair all the way through, again, but I will warn you, this game controls like piss on the PC right now. The configurations are all messed up, but if you're ever wondering what game I'm playing on screen, I'll put it in the beginning of the video, key it in. I will mention it in the description, and sometimes I'll even give it a mention at the end of the video. And if you like what you saw, then like, comment, and subscribe. This is me, Mudahar, and I am out.